Good afternoon. I'm Scott Cooper. This is Keith Fink. And this afternoon's workshop will be on the top 5 lawsuits facing restaurant owners today. Even if you win, you lose. Now hold on to that thought. It gets better. Imagine this. I had a client that had a beautiful restaurant in Encino, also owned a very large parking lot next door. Recently, he noticed a homeless gentleman that used to hang out by his restaurant. Sometimes he'd go out there and give him lunch or give him dinner. A couple months later, he offers him a job to guard his parking lot so other customers from nearby businesses don't park up in his spots. Well, within that year of his employment with this restaurant owner, he gave him a full-time job as a dishwasher. He paid him money so he could find somewhere to live with roommates and to buy clothes. A few months after that, he even promotes him to a food prep. And this employee that he hired, he also even lent him $3,500 in order to get a trailer for him to live in by himself. Things seem to be going fine. About a year later, this gentleman comes in really upset seeing this restaurant owner and says, "I was pantsed in the kitchen." Well, the restaurant owner didn't think much about it because, he knew things seemed to be working fine in the kitchen. Sometimes they horseplay around, and he was pretty busy at the time, so he really didn't have the chance to fully investigate right then. 2 weeks later, he gets a lawsuit and tenders the lawsuit to me. I send it on to the employer practices liability insurance company that we had on him at the time. And what was very interesting is that the insurance company decided to fight this all the way to the court system. Probably because the amount that the other side wanted was so high, they had no choice but to fight it. Well, it went through the court system, and the insurance company won against this employee and his attorney. His claim was sexual harassment and also hostile work environment. He claimed that the entire time he worked in the restaurant, he was being harassed, bad language, and sexual innuendos. Well, that lawsuit cost over $250,000 for the insurance company to win. So imagine if that restaurant owner did not have employer practices liability insurance. Either he'd be paying a large amount of settlement or a tremendous amount in legal fees. Again, even if you win, you lose. Anytime you get a lawsuit, you always lose. For your restaurant today, you're all working so hard to improve the bottom line, to make a profit. You worry about your customers, you worry about your competitors, you worry about all the government regulations, and even today, as if you don't have enough to worry about, you worry about now Obamacare or the Affordable Health Care Act that's coming out January 1, 2015. You worry about, your customers, so many areas of concern to a restaurant owner today. But one of the biggest concern is if you have a lawsuit or a major claim, that could devastate your restaurant and cost a tremendous amount of money. Don't be thrown off guard. Expect the unexpected. We're going to be talking about today the 5 major lawsuits facing restaurant owners. That is liability, discrimination, wage and hour, wrongful termination, and sexual harassment. Keith and I will be giving you the tools, knowledge, and strategy that you can implement to reduce the possibility of these type of claims. And the very important, crucial steps, if you do get sued, the steps that you need to do to handle these type of claims. And it's not if, it's when. So many of these types of lawsuits against restaurant owners today. Keith is one of the top labor attorneys in Southern California. He handles hundreds of restaurants, defending them, and he's also a distinguished professor at UCLA. He's a litigator like no other. Take my word, don't get in a debate with him. But when you're in trouble, he's the attorney you want to call. The first thing I want to talk about is liability insurance. What does the liability comprise of? Limits on umbrellas, valet and garage keeper, non-owned auto, as well as entities. What's your potential loss? What's your overall exposure? So many restaurateurs I talk with and meet with today, they think just by having a standard $1 million liability in their policy, they're covered, they have nothing to worry about. This is the farthest from the truth. This is one of the biggest areas of concern for a restaurant owner and one of the biggest unknowns. Everybody knows you could predict how much property insurance you have, but how much can you be sued for today? The first thing that you need to establish is you need to decide with your, maybe possibly with your attorney, is what assets that you need to protect and how much liability coverage that you truly need to have. Many policies that we write with, you could increase, instead of $1 million per occurrence, which is per claim, or $2 million aggregate, you could increase that policy to $2 million per occurrence, $4 million aggregate, for just a few $100s, giving you another couple $1 million worth of liability. And with some of my clients, we have strategies where we can increase the liability and it won't even cost anything more. Also very highly recommended, if you don't increase your liability coverages, is buying an umbrella, because the lawsuits, I said, are very, very large today. That's why so many landlords or franchisors are requiring $5 million or even $10 million in liability insurance. Another very important aspect of your liability insurance is valet and garage keepers. This is never part of your policy. It's always a separate policy or a separate endorsement. This is when an employee or an independent contractor is going to be parking vehicles for your restaurant. If it's an independent contractor, you want to make sure that you verify their insurance policy and that certificate of insurance that you get, so you know it's an active policy, as well as your restaurant needs to be named as additional insured. I had a restaurant that the valet parked a car. He hit somebody while he was attempting to park this car. The lady got really damaged, really a lot of bodily injury, sued the valet in the restaurant. That's when the restaurant owner found out that there's no insurance in place. The restaurant owner was found liable, cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars. In this case, the restaurant closed. Just something simple could have avoided that. If it's an employee, you want to make sure that you have the proper coverage and the proper limits, and this needs to be part of your commercial umbrella policy. Another important area is non-owned auto for delivery. So many restaurants today are delivering more and more. This is always a separate policy, and this is when the employees use their own vehicle to deliver food on your behalf. Now, a non-owned auto policy is going to cover between the minimum insurance that they have on their car, which is $15,000, to up to $1 million. This policy covers the difference. This is a really high potential risk within your restaurant. I had a barbecue restaurant, did over $1 million a year in delivery. The driver hit somebody, and the insurance policy I had on it for non-owned auto paid out over $1 million. Now, if it's your employee, some restaurants will call them independent contractors. But make sure you're checking with your CPA that it's meeting all the proper IRS rules. Just because you call them that doesn't mean they are. And I've seen many lawsuits where they truly were not independent contractors, and then you become liable for either liability or even bodily injury under work comp to this employee. What's covered in non-owned auto? Well, normally when this employee is driving their own vehicle, the vehicle normally is not your concern. If he hits somebody, that's third-party liability. That's what you could be sued for, as well as his body maybe need to be covered under workers' comp. And it's really important to have some type of, your broker should set up a motor vehicle report that you're checking these drivers' driving history. Because if they have a suspended license or a DUI, your policy could become null and void. Also, if it's your own vehicles that you're insuring yourself, make sure the limits are proper and adequate. And again, this needs to be part of your umbrella policy. You could control things within the doors of your restaurant. It's these outside exposures that cause the biggest problem. Everybody remembers Domino's Pizza, 30 minutes are free. Well, they cut that out. They had much too many claims in that area. Another portion of non-owned auto doesn't involve delivery. This is when your employee is doing catering or doing errands. Now normally this is always a separate endorsement or can be a separate policy. Make sure that your broker is aware of what percentage of catering that you're doing, and it can many times be added to your policy. If it's too large of a limit, you would need to go to a separate policy. This is also a very high risk because again, it's outside your doors that someone would be doing things during working hours. Something as simple as maybe going to the bank or maybe to Smart and Final, and they get in an accident, you could be liable for that, and usually the claims are very large. If it's your own vehicle, make sure your limits are adequate and it's part of your commercial umbrella as well. Entities. This is probably one of the least talked about areas, but very important. Most people aren't aware that when you have a claim, if all the proper structure of your organization is not listed on the policy, you may not have coverage. What do I mean by that? Well, there's additional insured and additional named insured. Maybe for your company, you have your corporation, your management company, a separate payroll company you set up. You have a partnership, limited or general. Then you want to make sure there are additional named insured, which is the top part of your policy. And of course, your landlord or equipment companies that you have for your restaurant, they would be additional insured. Something as simple as these couple words could avoid millions of dollars in losses to your restaurant. I've seen a number of policies where they weren't properly listed from other brokers and the policies were invalid. The insureds were on their own. The next area is probably going to be our greatest focus that we'll be talking about today, Keith and I. Employer practices liability insurance. This is everything I'll be talking about now. If you do not have an employer practices liability policy, all these areas I will be talking about will not be covered. They're only covered in this type of policy. Employer practices liability, I speak to a lot of restaurant owners, and so many don't have the policy for various reasons. Either your broker did not discuss it with you, maybe the importance of this type of policy was not brought up to you, or the limits were inadequate, and many times some important items were not part of your EPLI policy. What is part of employer practices liability insurance? The first part is discrimination. Americans with Disability Act and protected classes. Americans with Disability Act, probably so many have heard about all these lawsuits going around for restaurants, they don't meet this. Most of my restaurants will talk about grandfathering, which means that just because a restaurant's been there a lot of years, they think they're city, county, and state approved. They don't have to worry about the employer practice. They don't have to worry about American disability type of claims. That's really farthest from the truth. There's very little protection with grandfathering. So when someone's going to sue you for ADA, it's actually a federal type of item, the Americans with Disability Act. Not having this in your EPLI policy, the cost could be exorbitant. They could be, your accessibility as simple as your mirror in your bathroom could be a ½ inch too high. I've had various claims like this. Parking spaces are a ½ inch too narrow for handicapped parking spaces, aisleways, ramps. So many areas you could be vulnerable on it. Service animals. I had a restaurant that a gentleman came in with his working dog. There was nothing showing that the dog was a working dog, because usually you'll see a little something that's on top of the dog, or some type of flag, or even the owner of this dog will have something to show he's certified. He had nothing to show the restaurant manager. He wanted to come in with a giant Rottweiler inside the restaurant. And the manager says, no, I'm not going to let you in the restaurant, but I'll let you sit on the patio. Well, he sued the restaurant owner for discrimination, and this gentleman won. Almost any type of dog could be a service dog, whether they show documentation or not. This is another big part of area of the Americans with Disability Act. The key with this is, and I can't ever stress it enough, is that many items I've been talking about, like this one, need to be part of your employer practices liability policy. Many times it's an option, many times it's not that expensive to add it, and it's something you really want to check for very carefully. Protected classes. Even someone could come to your restaurant as an applicant or an interview and not even be part of your organization, and he could sue you. What is protection classes? It could be so many areas: age, race, natural origin, sexual orientation, disability, and of course religion. Another big aspect of employer practices is wage and hour law. Could be employee classification, meal and rest breaks, class action suits. Employee classification. Just because you call them a manager doesn't mean they could be a manager. It's so important when they're exempt employees like a manager, someone on payroll, or hourly employees, or referred to non-exempt employees, that you're working with a labor type of attorney to make sure that you're classifying everybody properly and you're paying the proper pay and overtime pay. This is a really big area, and many restaurants in California were sued because of the misclassifications. Meal and rest breaks. This is such an area of vulnerability to restaurants. And everybody, if you're not, the Brinker case last year decided on meal breaks not having to be required but optional, but you have to allow your employees time to take these meal breaks. This is another area that spending a couple $100 with a labor attorney can avoid some major lawsuits in this area. And even though I'm still seeing dozens of claims today in this area, because now employers are saying, well, you really didn't give me the time to take the break. This is an area you want to really check very carefully today. Class action. This is when an employee is going to make a lawsuit against you. He goes to his attorney, and many times the attorney will want to join additional employees to be a class action lawsuit. This is a big current trend that's going on today. They're very costly, and some EPLIs will cover these, and some policies will not. Again, it's very important to check to make sure you have this important coverage. A big area of restaurants today, another one, is wrongful terminations. We get these claims daily, and these happen all the time. Wrongful terminations, what's part of that? At-will employment, employee handbook, and documentation. For at-will employment, how many think just because you have at-will employment in your employee handbook that you're protected? You don't have to worry about these type of claims. That gives you such limited coverage. That's the furthest from the truth on that, is that it's not going to stop lawsuits against you. A constructive discharge could even be an employee that quits on his own accord but could still sue you because maybe the environment was unbearable. It's another very important aspect of your employee handbook. You hear a lot of talk about employee handbooks today. So many restaurants I come across today, they get an employee handbook from a friend, maybe a prior restaurant you worked at, or maybe off the internet. This has to be tailored to your business with the specific rules of your restaurant. It has to be reviewed annually with a labor attorney because there's so many laws that are changing constantly. What's included? Part of the items included in employee handbook is at will, a sexual harassment policy, the very important arbitration agreement, and this must be distributed to all your employees and signed. You just can't leave it on your shelf. Documentation. I don't know how many times an employee will come to a restaurant owner with an alleged claim, or they're bothered, or they want to make an allegation of something, and that wrong actions are done by the restaurant owner. Here's another area for just a couple $100. You could call a labor attorney, such as like Keith, and he could avoid hundreds of thousands of dollars of lawsuit. Within the last 48 hours, 3 of my restaurants he spoke with, he was probably on the phone with them less than 5 minutes. These restaurants had to terminate someone, had to fire them. They didn't know that you have to pay them on the spot, that day. Just something as simple as not doing something like that can cost thousands of dollars in penalties, as well as open you to lawsuits. Another extremely important area a lot of people heard about, sexual harassment. This could be verbal or nonverbal, fraternization, third party, amongst a number of items. Verbal and nonverbal is such an encompassing area. It could be jokes, maybe one person say it, another person interprets it differently. It could be emails, it could be texting. My kids use the term sexting. It could be the same or opposite sex. Most important is a thorough, objective neutral investigation. And here's another area that everybody knows the state law that when you have over 50 managers that you need to provide sexual harassment training. And that's every 2 years. I recommend, again, spending a couple $100, train no matter how many managers you have, that at least that every other year, even if it's not even required. A little simple training can prevent hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawsuit, because so many managers and owners and employees, they don't know what construes sexual harassment, and it's such a broad area today. It could even be finger symbols. It doesn't even have to again be verbal. Fraternization. Fraternization could be employee to employee or employee to manager. Could even be a consensual relationship. I had one restaurant where the waitress had I'm not going to go too details here, non-intercourse sex with the manager in the restaurant after hours. This was going on for a number of months. Well, once they broke up, it usually happens when there's a breakup, there's a claim. She made a claim that the manager sexually harassed her, coerced her, and forced her. Well, they had an employer practice liability policy with us. The payout was over $300,000. And one of the worst things for the restaurant owners, besides that they knew they were covered, is the employee, the waitress that made this claim, she could not be fired. She was a protected class, so they get to see her every day, knowing everything that happened before. Third parties. This is an area I'm seeing a big trend with restaurants today. This can be sexual harassment between employee to a vendor or an employee to a customer. So again, make sure these type of items as well can be covered in your EPLI policy. Many times it's an option for either minimal or no cost. You can add that to protect yourself against this. Directors and officers. This is you have investors in your restaurant and they sue you. Well, who's covered? Who's covered under directors and officers is the owners, directors, and officers. Everybody that's a non-investor that has an ownership interest. Well, what can you be sued for? If you're a restaurant and you have investors, or are going to be getting investors, you could be sued for non-performance, misleading, mismanagement. So many areas you could be sued for just by offering them, you don't know how your restaurant may perform. I had a restaurant franchisee, had an investor, said, well, it didn't do what you purported. I had a directors and officers on this, one of my clients. The payout on the insurance was over $100,000. And yet, he didn't think he did even anything wrong with that. I hope my portion was of interest on the insurance aspects. Keith, who's the true outstanding labor expert, is going to talk about the legal aspects of employer practice liability. Thank you.